Hello, everybody, and welcome. Today we are running the Masterclass series Module 4, which is the Clinical Trial Network and Industry Partnerships module. I'm Jennifer Thompson. I'm chairing the session today, and we have Vivian from ACTA who is ably personing the slides for us, and we have two speakers. I will introduce them, but I will start with our acknowledgement of country, if I may. Thanks, Vivian. So I'd like to acknowledge the country on which we all meet today, and the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet today in multiple places, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. And I and we all extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here in the session today as well. So if I go back to introducing our two speakers for today, firstly, we have Kate Church. Kate has a PhD in immunotherapy and hematology, and she completed that at the Alfred Hospital and Monash University. Following her postdoc studies at the Alfred, Kate moved into industry and has had an extensive clinical research background and career with 17 years experience in industry, working in both clinical and medical roles. She currently works at Bristol Myers Squibb as the Associate Director, Regional Clinical Operations for Australia and New Zealand, with responsibility for clinical trial managers, clinical trial associates, and protocol managers working across phase 1 through 4 clinical trial programs, including investigator-initiated research and compassionate use programs. We also have with us Dr. Lorraine Chantrell. Lorraine treats patients with any cancers of the digestive tract, as well as gynecological and lung cancers. She has extensive experience managing oncology clinical trials and is the principal investigator on several clinical trials in gastrointestinal cancers. Lorraine is keen to increase the number of clinical trials conducted in the Illawarra and Shoalhaven local health district here in New South Wales. She's also keen to build the region's clinical trial portfolio to give patients access to new and emerging therapies. As well as doing all of that, Lorraine is associated with the Australasian Gastrointestinal Trials Group, AGITG, where they create and facilitate clinical trials in cancers of the digestive tract. She has served on the AGITG Upper GI Working Party since its inception in 2011 and has chaired the Working Party from 2014 through 2019. She's also been appointed to the Board of Directors of AGITG in 2016, and in May 2020 became the first female chair of the AGITG and GI Cancer Institute. So I welcome both of our speakers here with us today. We are going to start today with housekeeping. So during this session, you please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A section. If you can't find that, it might be at the three little dots down on the far right-hand side of your screen in this module that you've got popped up. You can also raise your hand to speak. And so I'm going to start now with leading in and letting Lorraine take the floor. Thanks, Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you everyone for being here this afternoon on this webinar. I'm coming to you from Dharawal country, which is a country of the Wadi Wadi people in the Illawarra of New South Wales, and I too pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land. So today we're talking about industry engagement, and I just want to set the context a little bit about why it's really important that we engage with industry. And I'm going to talk about those industry collaborations really from 2 points of view. From the point of view of the clinical trial networks and cooperative groups, but also from the point of view of investigators at sites as well. So I think we would all agree that often our industry partners are really holding the keys to new treatments, and we really want to provide access to these treatments for our patients, and particularly for patients in the public sector, for example, who may not be aware of new treatments coming about. And it's imperative that through our networks, we can provide these treatments to perhaps some disadvantaged communities. And both Kate and I are going to talk a little bit about how we might do that better. So I think there are a lot of good things to be had from engaging in a collaboration with industry. As I've said, often they have cutting edge treatments that we can access, and we can use these new agents to help train our staff. Now, I was very lucky to be involved in clinical trials early in my training, and I was able to get experience using drugs before they came into the marketplace routinely. And that's a really great thing for our doctors to learn how to do. So it provides opportunities for patients, of course, to receive new treatments, but also for our clinical staff, doctors, nurses, and other staff in our units to be able to be trained in new medicines. Industry clinical trials will often offer more generously financial support than our publicly funded or investigator-led studies that do not involve industry collaboration. And the reality is that often these industry-sponsored trials are able to essentially cross-subsidize the running of lower budget investigator-led research and research that comes from our cooperative groups. So what are the models that we could use for industry collaboration? And I'm trying to think of models that might work at a site level, but also models that might work at a clinical trial network level. So if we just sort of sit and wait for clinical trial feasibilities to feed into our system in an ad hoc way, that doesn't really allow us to plan our clinical trials adequately. So it's much better to have, if you can, a systematic way of assessing new feasibilities. We can either do that by clinical area or by sponsor. So for example, if you have a particular industry collaborator that has medicines in a particular area of medicine, you might want to be looking at their pipeline in that particular area of medicine, looking at the gaps for that area for you, and then focusing on an industry collaboration with that provider with certain goals in mind. And this can be a very, really good relationship to have, because then you can actually be ahead of the game, I think, in many ways, and maybe your site or your network may be able to gain access to these new pipeline treatments for your particular gap. And obviously, that would be meeting the needs of the industry sponsor as well. I have seen, and we in AGITG and also at the site that I work, we have actually developed in some cases a memorandum of understanding with an industry partner, and usually what it involves, it's a kind of first opportunity kind of a memorandum of understanding, and we're never obliged to do the studies that that particular provider has, but they've agreed to show us what studies they have available first, so that we've got an opportunity to join in early. So I think it's really important for you and your trial networks to identify your areas of need and gaps in portfolios, so that you can drive the relationship in key therapeutic areas with your key industry partners. That probably segues pretty well into Kate talking about the partnerships that that can be undertaken.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lorraine, so much. And thanks everyone for joining today, and to ACTA for the opportunity to participate in this workshop and share an industry perspective. So if we move to the next slide. Lorraine has talked about some of the industry partnerships. I just wanted to share a little bit about what this could look like. So Obviously, industry partners with institutes and hospitals for industry-sponsored clinical trials, where the industry partner is the sponsor, but also industry partners do support investigator-sponsored research, so ISRs. I think you'll find that many companies have different acronyms and names for these sorts of research studies, so they might be IIRs or ISTs or IITs. They're all very similar in terms of meaning that the investigator or the cooperative group is the sponsor of the research. And I'm going to talk mostly about that today in my presentation, but I'll touch on a couple of other areas as well. It could also be preclinical collaboration, so industry partners partnering in, benchtop research with research institutes. There can also be research collaborations as well, in which there is a joint partnership in design of clinical trials and so forth. There's also opportunity for industry to sponsor cooperative group meetings or disease-specific congresses. And then we also see examples where industry partners with patient advocacy groups as well, for a number of different reasons. It could be around trial recruitment, strategies, patient materials, ensuring that what is being produced is going to be fit for purpose for patients. So it could look like a number of different options, but there are many benefits of industry partnerships. And I think when I reflect on what the benefits are, I really think of this as shared knowledge and innovation. So in these partnerships, both parties really benefit from the exchange of knowledge, ideas, and it is that fostering of innovation and continuous improvement in healthcare, which I think is really important. I think most importantly, underpinning all of this is hopefully improved patient outcomes. So Lorraine talked about how often industry has novel new therapeutics, and these partnerships are a way to be able to, in some instances, access earlier treatment options for patients. But we've certainly seen successful collaborations leading to the development of new therapies, medical devices or technologies, new medicines registered by the TGA, or even broadening of existing restrictions on the pharmaceutical benefit scheme to what it currently was when it was first approved. And through that, there's obviously publication dissemination. So when we do research, it's great that there's obviously an outcome where usually there's publications in scientific journals and obviously contributing to that holistic advancement of science for both academic and industry partners. So a number of benefits to the partnerships, which are really critical. Next slide, please. So I've just got one slide on industry-sponsored clinical trials. So I think this is where, as Lorraine was mentioning, it's really important to understand where your areas of interest are, the therapeutic areas where you've got that expertise and what your site capabilities are, and proactively connecting with your industry partners to discuss that. And it's really good to do that, proactively, so both parties can understand the potential capabilities that you have as a site or as an investigator. Industry, I can speak for the company that I work for, but also I'm sure more broadly, have a real interest in broadening their trial sites, increasing diversity of trial participants. And so, really love the opportunity to connect with different sites to understand capabilities and where their areas of interest are. So when we do get feasibilities come through, that we can go, right, okay, well, we know that this group, this site, this investigator has a real interest here, and we can reach out to them. Confidentiality agreements or the memorandum of understandings, which are different things, can be put in place to support connection for that ongoing feasibility assessments. So usually what I find is that when we connect with sites or institutes around capabilities, we often move to put a confidentiality agreement in place. So we have that there ready. And what that means is when there's a feasibility that comes through, we can engage with you straight away. We don't have to wait to go through that CDA process. Because oftentimes when feasibilities come, there's quite a quick turnaround time in order to be able to go back and share what the perspective is for Australia in that particular clinical trial landscape. So when those feasibilities do come through, obviously a number of the sort of feasibility questions that are asked really focus on current treatment practices, you know, understanding what that landscape looks like in Australia and whether that's consistent, perhaps on a global level with the trials that they're looking to run, what realistic patient enrolments could be, lab requirements and logistics, and this is important particularly for some rural sites if you've got to meet deadlines for getting samples on flights out of the country for central labs and things like that. Competing studies, access to standard of care medicine, what your startup requirements are and the timelines. You know, a lot of industry partners will be quite interested to understand how quickly sites can start up, but also, you know, what your diversity of your clinical trial patients are. You know, do you need translated materials and languages? These are all good things to think about up front to be able to support, you know, the sites or the collaborative groups should, you know, they participate in the study so we can ensure that we can maximise and have as broad access as possible to the study. There's also satellite sites as well that something that we can look at as well. But I'm going to focus my attention now to investigator-sponsored research, which is where I'm going to focus the bulk of my presentation. So investigator-sponsored research is really an independent scientific research study or trial in which either the individual or the institution, so this could be a research institute, a hospital, a collaborative cooperative group, where they are the sponsors of the study. So they're accepting the legal and regulatory responsibilities of the study. An industry partner is really removed from the development and the conduct of the research, except for obviously project management aspects, funding, drug requirements, etc. Now, for investigator-sponsored research studies, there may be a request for funding, drug, or both of the industry partners. So it could be a mixture or one of all those. There would be a written executed contract between the sponsor and the industry partner, and these IFR studies can cover really all types and phases of research, from interventional through to non-interventional studies. Next slide, please. One thing I would note is that probably the process across industry, if I look broadly, may be different for different companies, and that's just something to bear in mind. So some companies have a rolling submission process. So that is, you know, you as the investigator or a collaborative group can submit a proposal to that industry partner at any point of the year, and that will go through a reviewed process. Other companies run what's called a request for proposal, an area of interest cycle, if you like, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. That's something, as an example, that BMS runs. They do have an RFP process. They'll take you through what that looks like. It's also important to understand through networking with your industry partners, so whether that be your medical contacts or your clinical contacts, what the funding structure looks like. So for some industry partners, the pot of money for ISRs may sit at a global level, and for other companies it might sit at a local level where they're the decision makers. For companies where it sits at a global level, the decision makers aren't sitting in the country, but your industry partners here will certainly be advocating and supporting your application at a global level. And it does become at a global level somewhat competitive, particularly in an RFP process, because you know, if you get duplicative studies coming in from multiple countries that are all similar, it can also lead to opportunity, because sometimes there's opportunity to connect and collaborate across countries if there are similar ideas and things coming from different places around the world. But what I would say is that connection with industry is really important ahead of your submission, to make sure that your submission is aligned with the same areas as the industry partner, an opportunity to ask questions and understand so that when your local industry partners ask questions from our global team members, that they're in a position to be able to respond quite quickly and advocate for the study on your behalf. Next slide. So this is just an example of RFPs and AOIs. So as I mentioned, BMS uses this process for our ISRs. So we used to do a rolling submission, and we've moved to this in recent years. And the reason why we have done that is to provide greater transparency and guidance to investigators on what areas of research we are interested in. So for a particular therapeutic area or compound, where is it that we're looking to support independent research? And similarly, as well as saying these are the areas that we will support, we're quite specific in saying these are the areas that we won't support. And we've done that to be able to try and streamline investigators' time, because it is quite time consuming from an investigator's perspective, like the feedback that we receive in putting these proposals together. So the greater transparency that we can have, hopefully that, targets obviously the submissions that we're receiving, and obviously where investigators or collaborative groups are investing their time. With the request for proposal cycles, they are often defined as like a pre-concept, endorsed concept, and then a full concept cycle. And these change from one cycle to the next. So, I mean, for those, if you look on the BMS website at the moment, we have a cycle open in neuroscience at this point in time, and it gives clear guidance on dates that proposals need to be in by. Next slide. So this is just an example where once the areas of interest are posted, there is a time frame given for sites or groups to be able to submit pre-concepts, which is a really condensed version of what their proposal is. There's a window period here where that then pre-concept will be reviewed, and then selected concepts invited to proceed to full concept, where there will be an opportunity to submit a fuller submission, and then that goes through obviously for review, and then a decision is made and communicated back to the investigator on the site. So I think with the concepts that are submitted, they need to be really scientifically well designed. So I think things that groups need to think about, whether it's a single country study or sites that you're proposing, or whether you're looking to do like a multi-country and multi-country multiple sites ISR. Are you looking to get your support from a single industry partner or multiple industry partners? And is the request for drug funding or both? And this is really important because sometimes industry partners move at different paces. We have different processes, and so I think this is really important to understand upfront. You obviously need to have your schema, your endpoints, your patient population, your statistical plan. Are you doing biomarker work? Any safety considerations, and what the drug supply is. And I would say here the drug supply is particularly important if you're looking at multi-country and multi-industry partners in terms of the distribution and how that could work. Timelines and milestones need to be included in there, and it's really important that they're realistic. So there's no point being aggressive in your milestones unless you feel that you can achieve them, because the moment that the proposal gets approved, that's when the time starts, and most companies will have time frames that they're hoping to achieve in terms of protocol and contracting and things like that. You will also need to provide a budget breakdown, and this needs to be detailed and fairly accurate. And again, things like, for example, drug supply, and this is coming from a place of experience where there might be multiple countries involved, and it was thought that the industry partner could just distribute drugs to every single country and every single site that you're hoping to have involved. But actually in some countries or in Europe, there's actually a requirement for a third-party vendor to actually distribute the drug, and that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars extra that needs to go into your budget, and it needs to go in at the start as opposed to realizing that later on and then trying to seek approval for extra funds. So if we move to the next slide, so proof concept, as I was mentioning, most industry partners would have sort of set timeframes that they're hoping to achieve. And really, these should have been discussed and upfront as you're looking to put in that submission. So you also have clarity on what the expectations are should the study be approved. Contracting, sometimes industry partners have, say their templates that they, would like to use as the framework for the contract specific to ISRs. I think in other scenarios I've seen where contracting has been done on the collaborative group or the institute template. So that might differ from industry partners, but usually contracting will have milestone-bound payments in there that might be payments upon startup and then specific recruitment milestones, interim reports and final reports. It's also really important to make sure that the safety reporting requirements are accurately captured for the type of study that you're doing. So that might look different if it's an interventional study, obviously, versus perhaps like a non-interventional study. Drug supply and labelling, I've talked a little bit already, but that is important to think about up front, what that would look like, who's going to be doing the logistics and distribution. And then obviously making sure that your timelines are realistic, because there is an expectation that that sites, collaborative groups deliver to the agreed timeframes that we've set out in the contract. Next slide, please. So I think just some of the considerations that I have seen and learnt, over my time working in the ISR space, is that ongoing communication between sponsor and industry partner is really critical. So not just for study updates, but that ongoing conversation about where potential challenges might be, where there might be additional support required, or is there any changes to the timeline. So those milestones and timelines that you set out in your original submission and contract, if they look like they're not going to be met or they're going to blow out slightly, then those are the sorts of conversations that we should be engaging with together up front and working together to understand what we could put in place to either support or change those timelines. And I think where I see the biggest challenges, just in terms of getting the studies started, often lie with multi-company and multi-country studies. So that's just the different timelines and processes that companies have and working at different paces. Just as an example, we've got, one that we're working on at the moment where we've got a protocol amendment that has been sent through, where our process has been substantially quicker than another industry partner's, but for the collaborative group that's involved, they can't proceed until they've got both partners' approval of the contract protocol amendment. Understanding your institute and local governance regulations and restrictions. So some institutes in Australia are unable to support international institutes or sites participating. They are unable through their governance able to support international collaborations. So understanding that up front, particularly if you're looking at multi-country studies or international partners being involved in your particular ISR, it's really important to look at that up front, because it saves a lot of time if we can get that right and understand that up front. And then, as I mentioned before, that drug distribution to other countries, if a vendor is required, it can be quite expensive, and much better to flag that up front and have provision in your budget for that than trying to secure that additional funding later on down the track. But I'll leave it there, and yeah, happy to take any questions when we get to Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kate. And now we're going to move back to Lorraine, who's going to talk to us about successful examples of industry collaboration.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Jenny. So the first sort of sphere that I'm going to cover is talking about successful collaborations that we've seen with our cooperative group, and I'm going to refer to some clinical trials that we've run through AGITG. And generally speaking, these ones that I'm going to use examples of are trials that we have designed and thought of, and then we've gone out to industry to see whether they will agree to fund the drug or in fact the whole trial for that research. So many of you will know that my favorite subject is pancreas cancer, which is a very poor prognosis cancer and an area of need. And it took me some time, I have to say, to convince industry that this was an area where we could perhaps try immunotherapy in the neoadjuvant setting, because many of you would know that immunotherapy has been a failure in advanced pancreas cancer. And so we actually did a number of applications like the ones Kate was describing to get industry partners. And I'm very pleased to say that we did eventually collaborate with AstraZeneca in providing durvalumab for the NEO-IMPACT study. The other thing that I think that the company was very pleased about was the translational endpoints that were included in that trial. And so they were very interested to have a part in thinking about the microbiome in relation to immunotherapy. So that, I think, may have hooked the industry partner in that particular example. The other things that were important for AstraZeneca in considering that collaboration was this area of need, the fact that they were helping the community, and also this particular clinical trial was funded entirely from philanthropy and donors, and most of those donors were people who had cared for a person with pancreas cancer who had died. So it had a number of things, I think, that helped us get that collaboration over the line. Other collaborations that have been relatively successful, I've been using a couple of drugs, maybe older drugs that perhaps the industry is not really looking for a new market, but are willing to have the older drug tested. So that's been an interesting example. And probably one of AGITG's best collaborations has been with Bayer Pharmaceuticals in testing regorafenib in new markets, particularly in the area of advanced gastric cancer, and then pairing that regorafenib with immune therapy. I think that that particular drug had started to sort of not have a very big market really in cancer medicine, and the idea of finding a new market for it was very appealing. And in the case of the integrate studies that AGITG have done alongside Bayer, Bayer have funded both the drug and the trial itself. And Kate was an excellent example of a really great collaboration where it's been an international study with sites all over the world in Asia, Europe, and even a couple of sites in the USA, which is difficult regulatory-wise to do, but we have been able to do that. And that's been an ongoing collaboration over a period of more than 10 years. So a really good example of a successful one. Other things that we've done have been on grant-funded studies. So on grant-funded studies, many of you may already realize that oftentimes when we're applying for a grant, the granting bodies have pretty much a rule that says, well, we're not paying for the drug. We'll only fund this research if you've managed to acquire the drug some other way. And that means that our industry partnerships really have to be very close to convince our industry partners to help us with a very useful scientific question in a grant-funded study. So one example of that is that we're moving towards doing a trial using two drugs, one from one company and one from another. And I think this might be a good thing for us to talk about, Kate, in the chat afterwards, is how we manage that relationship when we have two companies collaborating on the same clinical trial. So the Pomola study, which will be opening soon, combines olaparib with pembrolizumab in high TMB pancreas cancer. And that's been actually quite hard to get all of those partnerships aligned, and that's a grant-funded study. So we'll talk about the sort of problems and pitfalls a little bit later, perhaps, where we can have a chat with some of the attendees. But I'll just go to the next slide, which I think just talks about how we've actually started being much more proactive in AGITG and going out to companies, asking to meet with them, particularly companies that are emerging, like new biotech companies that are coming through. We have recognized that in the field of immunotherapy, for example, that maybe we should be looking at companies who are just developing their medications and are very interested in getting them into the market, rather than perhaps with companies that already have very established market share. And so what we recognize is that whatever we do with our industry partnerships has to have mutual benefit. So our cooperative group has got to think a little bit about what sort of market the industry want, and we need to go to them to say, okay, what are you looking at? And we need to say, okay, these are the gaps in our research. Are there any points there where we're actually meeting? Because then we can really do some really good work together. And it's finding those convergences, which has been really important. It takes a bit of time and a lot of meetings, I have to say. The next slide really talks about site-specific collaborations, and I'm very, very proud of the clinical trials group in the site that I work, and this is an example from the hematology space. So it just so happens that some hematologists at our site have been particularly active in the field of myeloma, and actually had run some trials very efficiently with Sanofi, a company with presence in this area. And what they did was Sanofi and the clinical trial site developed a partnership alliance, which allowed the site early insight into the drug development portfolio and a sort of first right of refusal for any new clinical trials coming out of Sanofi. And that was really made possible by the site performing very well with respect to startup timelines, enrollments particularly, and timely data entry. So it was kind of like a win-win and a bit of a reward for the site. And the good thing is that this process has enabled feedback on the site metrics once or twice a year. And that's part of the agreement, that we kind of meet some KPIs in terms of performance. And that two-way communication allows us to change things. We can be quickly responsive to comments from the industry partner and how we can do things better. But at the end of the day, the wonderful thing about this program has been that patients with myeloma in this district are able to get access to wonderful treatments that they wouldn't otherwise be able to. So that's a really cool. And I really look forward to some discussion with our attendees today.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kate and Lorraine, for your words of wisdom. We have had a few questions come in pre the meeting, pre the presentation, but everybody seems to be really shy about putting questions in during the presentation. So I'm going to start with one of my own that actually also incorporates the same theme as someone sent a question about at the beginning. So my question, and whoever else put this in, our question is around how the partnership between industry and the clinical trial networks can be leveraged to, in other ways, I guess, you know, as clinical trial networks, we're mostly, if not all, not-for-profit. And so we need support not only for funding our clinical trials activity, but also in other ways. So can you both speak to the other ways that you're aware of that industry is supporting the clinical trial networks?
So I can say a few things, because industry is definitely supporting the network that I work in several ways. Firstly, what I mentioned before about the grant applications. So really we leverage that industry partnership to get a successful grant, and we would not get the grant if we did not have that partnership in place. Secondly, I think I wouldn't be speaking out of turn to say that in essence, some of our industry-sponsored studies do subsidise some of the studies we're running on very tight budgets. So we do budget our industry-sponsored study with an administrative fee for our trials network running that study. And we do, of course, a lot of work for that fee, but as you said, we're not for profit, and we use that fee for staffing, and some of those staff will end up doing work on other studies, perhaps investigator-led studies on lower budgets.
And Kate, from your perspective, is there anything that you can speak to about other forms of support being provided by industry?
Yes, I think I see a lot of industry partners who sponsor the collaborative group meetings that occur throughout the year, and I think that's a mutually beneficial opportunity for networking at those meetings, as well as often discussion starters around new trials that people are interested in. And I think that is really important, as I've said in my presentation, that ability to be able to come together, and network and connect and understand where people's interests are, understand where industry's interests are, because I think when you can get that sweet spot in the middle where you've got areas of interest that align for both, that's where I feel like there's opportunity. You can see trials that come out of that.
Yeah, and I know from my own perspective here at ANZUP, we're very grateful for the industry sponsorships that are provided to us for our annual scientific meeting each year, and also 2 smaller meetings. So we've got a bladder and prostate cancer masterclass happening at the end of this week, and that does have industry sponsorship, as well as did our Best of GU dinner last week. So for those who are listening, and it's not just about partnering between the networks and industry in terms of clinical trials. There are other ways that we can partner and that we work together as well to improve health for all of Australians, and hopefully, everybody around the world in the end. I guess that leads into another question, Kate. If a group or a person, if a network or person doesn't have connections within industry already, how can they best make or develop those contacts? And what conferences, for example, what conferences would we see industry at each year?
Yes, I think for any of the industry partners, they'll have a pipeline of clinical trials and research and therapeutic areas that they're working in. So usually, those industry partners would potentially be present at a therapeutic area congress. So say, for example, it could be a hematology pipeline that an industry partner has. They could potentially have a booth or be a sponsor at the blood meetings, for example. So there's ways there. I think you can also, I certainly get a number of queries that come through our corporate website, or through our medical information email address, or where people can submit queries, and they can come from researchers saying, I've got this interest, or I've got, our site has just recently changed, or we've expanded, got new capabilities, and queries come that way, and that starts a conversation where we then might set up a meeting to understand what capabilities and interests and so forth are. So it can come in different ways. I think if you know someone, even if it's in not the right spot, so you might know, for example, a sales representative at a company. Now, they're not going to be the right person for you to necessarily chat to, but they can connect you through. So it can come in lots of different forums, I think, to be able to start those conversations.
And I think, Lorraine, you wear 2 hats. You wear a clinical hat and you wear a governance of a network hat. you know, what is your opinion, or where have you seen those connections being made and being strengthened?
Yeah, so I think we have very strong connections with industry, and as you pointed out earlier, the connections at meetings that we have, we generally, because we're a cancer group, our meetings tend to be at big cancer conferences, and at our own meeting, like you have at ANZUP, we have a similar sort of meeting each year, and we invite our industry partners to sponsor the meeting and come to the meeting and interact with our membership. But we have international meetings. That's probably where we gain the most, actually. So I guess what we've learned is that Australia is probably quite a small player globally, and some of the time we're really trying to sort of get in front of the global team from some of these big companies, and often we do that if we go to a major meeting in the US, for example, and we can really get in front of the global team, because although we're a relatively small company, I think, well, we're all biased because we're all here in Australia, but I think we've punched above our weight when it comes to, clinical research over the years, and we have done some really great studies, both initiated in Australia, but involving international partners. So it's kind of cool to meet those global industry people at some of those overseas meetings. Yeah, I was gonna, can I ask a question myself, Jenny? Is that okay? Or someone's actually got a question coming in, I think.
Well, why don't you go first, Lorraine,
Okay.
and then we can take this one as well.
Yeah, so what I find the most challenging, Kate, is when we have, we've got this sort of biomarker-directed therapy, emerging for most cancers. And as clinicians, what we would like in an absolute ideal world, let's say for cholangiocarcinoma, in which 35% of people have a target, we would like a clinical trial with 27 different companies and a different drug from each company, and we are going to find a patient with mutation A and they fit into the basket getting a drug from BMS, and then another patient's got a different mutation and they need a drug from another company. But I have never been able to crack this nut to get, a lot of companies to cooperate together on a single study. Have you got examples of being able to do that within your company?
I think the only I know of one study, or actually there's probably a couple of studies that are run from the child group, was it the Children's Oncology group, and set up by the US, multi-country studies and more like basket studies, where, as you said, patient comes in, there might be a biomarker, and then they put into different baskets and different drugs. So I have seen that in the children's group. So I know that they do exist, and we support in terms of provision of drug in a couple of those instances. But often in those scenarios, they're all driven out of the US. So I probably don't have that hands-on piece, except for obviously getting involved with drug supply and perhaps the logistics of it in the country.
Yeah.
But it is possible.
Yeah, I'm glad you think it's possible. That's great.
Possible. I'm sure it's complex, as we've talked about before. I think it's such a fantastic opportunity to be able to collaborate in terms of advancing medicine when you can partner. So, there might be a few more challenges that come with it, but I think there are a lot of benefits as well.
Yeah. And I can say from an ANZUP perspective that when you talked about having a trial with 2 industry partners contracting into it, we have actually got one in startup at the moment with 3 industry partners contracting into it. And we have a second one that is now working its way through the early stages of development and has, in principle, approval from 3 industry partners.
Yeah. And I think this is the future, Jenny, that this idea of these, rather than doing 3 separate trials, which is crazy on the same population of people, it's better to do it all in one study, so
Yeah.
much more efficient.
And
Yeah.
it just so happens we're starting to look at how different products, you know, investigational products interact with each other, and how they could be used in partnership with each other, I guess. One of the things I could say from having gone through that process for anybody out there is the most important thing to pay attention to in the agreements and the agreements process is making sure that everybody is in alignment and is happy to be in alignment in the intellectual property clauses in your agreements. So that requires quite a level of trust from your partners. Yeah, so that's something to pay attention to, those clauses and how they're worded. We do have some questions coming in now. So I have from Adam, what CTN platforms do you pitch to attract funding for support aside from specific trial costs? Now we have an acronym in there that can be used interchangeably for several things here in clinical trials. So I'm wondering whether that means clinical trial network platforms. Do you pitch to attract funding for support aside from specific trial costs? So Adam, without fully understanding the context, I'm wondering, Lorraine, whether that means, is there anything that you do as a trial network that AGITG does as a trial network that is an outreach? So maybe your website or other things like that.
Yeah, so we do have a website which we're revising, but I think the main thing that, the main, I guess, service that we as a cooperative group offer the industry partner is that we are the connector for all of the health practitioners in that area that the industry wants to put their product into. I mean, I would say that's the biggest attraction for us. So we can essentially link the industry with, you know, pretty much every site in the country, and we can find, if it's a rarer cancer, we know who the people are who treat that rare cancer, and we can connect the sponsor with those sites. But when they mean platform, I don't know whether you mean clinical research organizations. So
Adam, if you're still there, if you would like to provide more context in the chat, that'd be great. In the meantime, I might move on to the next question, which has come from Vino. So Vino's asking, when it comes to engaging industry for sponsorship, is there any guidance on how to best determine the monetary value of sponsorships for ASMs and for smaller education offerings?
So we tend to go to the industry partners and ask them, but where we probably have been the most successful is when we've run a preceptorship or an educational session sponsored by industry, and the sorts of monetary offerings we're looking at in that case is probably more than $100,000 sometimes to fund a whole preceptorship with, you know, a number of people coming in from all over Australia and New Zealand, as well as the facilitators and so on. So that sort of level. At our ASM, we have different levels of sponsorship, which we call platinum, gold, silver, bronze, and of course they have different monetary levels, you know, starting at around $50,000, and I think the bronze sponsorships are about between $5,000 and $10,000. So they do have monetary values. I hope that helps, but Jenny probably knows this better than I do.
I don't know about that. I know we have separate teams that talk to the separate teams within the industry partner. So, you know, we have our clinical trials team that talk to the clinical trials funding parts of the industry partner institution, and we have fundraising and philanthropy members of our of ANZUP team who separately speak to the industry partners about those sort of separate funding avenues. Yeah. And Adam has provided more context. So Adam has said he's heard investment in biobanks about industry investing in biobanks, and he's also interested in other things that can be pitched to industry.
Kate, do you know anything about investment in biobanks or other platforms?
I'm not familiar with investment in biobanks. I mean, there's a whole raft of other things. I mean, within industry, there's so many different divisions within industry. There's obviously, where I work in our clinical trial section, we've got medical teams, but there's also obviously, sales and marketing departments within the company. So there's different, companies who, might have, programs for patient support programs or things like that companies might be looking for. So there's different things, technologies, apps, all of those sorts of things that, companies might look at to support, best practice and best use of their medicines within the patient population. But I'm not so familiar with the biobanking, investment in biobanking.
In fact, infrastructure is one of the hardest things to get support for, I think. And sometimes we raise money philanthropically for that kind of infrastructure support, or obtain grants usually from the Australian federal government for that sort of thing. There's a couple of questions there about ethical conflicts of interest, and when the other person asked about funding a biobank, that would also, you'd have to be very careful about the way in which that agreement was entered into with respect to intellectual property and privacy laws for participants who contribute to the biobank if it was funded by industry. So that would be challenging, I think. And I think there are some challenging conflicts of interest. And of course, all of our investigators have to declare any kind of support that they have received from industry for their research, which includes funding the drug, includes funding the trial, but also includes funding that health practitioner in any way as well. And those are obviously very important things to declare. I would have to say that ethically, I don't think we're not very biased in my neck of the woods anyway, because often we're putting out applications to 5 different companies at once for a very similar drug, and we actually often don't really mind which company comes to the party. So we're not particularly beholden to any particular company, but more just trying to get the best agreement for our studies.
Yes, and I can see Wei Li on that same sort of theme has asked a question around how do you get clinician-led investigator teams and industry partners to trust one another and navigate through those potential conflicts of interest? And what are some of the good strategies and what are some of the red flags and don't do's?
Well, I think there's really rigorous controls around any sort of bias. It's in contracting, it's in disclosures. So there are a number of structures put in place to ensure that the partnership is ethical and all of those sorts of things. But I think in terms of that trust, I think it's coming back to that connection that you have, aligning on shared goals that you're hoping to achieve with the research that you might be partnering with. I also think it comes through delivery. If you you commit to something that you deliver on what you said you were going to deliver, that goes a long way for industry partners to want to come back and go, you're a great partner to work with. Yeah, I don't know whether, Lorraine, you want to add anything else in there?
Yeah, so I think what we do as a cooperative group is that if industry come to us with a trial, we don't just go, yeah, sure, we'll do that without any question. We actually say to them something along the lines that we're only interested in doing trials if we have real academic input into them. We're not a service to just, you know, run your study. That can happen at site level. So certainly at site level, trials will come to sites and they'll decide whether they want to do them just on whether they think that is useful. But for the cooperative group, we insist on academic input. And when that academic input is undertaken, as you said, Kate, there's so many checks and balances in place, particularly if it, you know, includes grant applications and so on, that there really is, I think, trust there, and that trust is maintained through those processes. I think there are some possible opportunities for people to do things that might be red flags. I would say, you know, very early biotech, you know, sort of handshaken things rather than anything in writing. They are red flags to me. I wouldn't be, you know, signing up to do, you know, studies if you don't really know what you're getting into. But I don't think that would happen at a cooperative group level. And I don't even think it would happen at kind of site level through our regulatory processes. But I think if you meet someone at a meeting and they say, oh, I've developed this drug in my garage and I want to test it, I'd be obviously be very reticent to take that one on.
No phase 1 trials then, Lorraine?
Yeah, well, maybe that's the same thing, right? So interesting that you mentioned phase 1 studies, because I think for the clinical trial networks, the phase 1 studies are a real challenge. So, you know, phase 1 studies tend to be done, you know, at just one site, but AGITG are looking at ways in which we can partner with industry to do phase 1 studies using a network of sites. Perhaps small networks of sites to do phase 1. And I think now with our communication being so good, that's probably possible to have, you know, a patient getting a dose at one site and then the next patient being dosed at a different site within the same study is probably possible with highly trained teams. But yeah, we haven't done it yet, but we're really looking towards doing that because we see that's really the future.
Yep, sounds exciting. We had a very large question from Vivek, who asked, and I think this one will be for you, Lorraine, how does your team currently address challenges such as ensuring regulatory compliance, managing multi-site coordination, tracking trial budgets, and maintaining real-time oversight of clinical trial progress? Do you use a platform that can manage this in one place?
I wish we had a platform that could do all that. That would be brilliant, but we don't have a platform. We have hardworking humans. And we actually recently, Vivek, undertook a sort of a self-audit of AGITG processes as a sponsor. And we actually did find that there were some things that we weren't doing well enough. And so we have recently undertaken quite a large quality assurance process, and we have employed a quality assurance officer to make sure that we are doing all of these things. So we do, I suppose, contract out some of these jobs. So we do have clinical research organizations that do some of the coordination of our studies. So we do use a variety of organizations actually. So we use the University Clinical Trials Centre, we use George Clinical, we use Walter and Eliza Hall, we use BACT, we use any, you know, there's a number of different partners. Tracking trial budgets, again, very challenging, and we have found that we need to do this much better because you're absolutely right. There's budget on day 1 and sometimes on day, you know, 561 they don't quite match and we're out of pocket, so we have to do that better. So you're right to point all of those things out. They're all really important. The reality is we probably have different processes for all of them. And we've got to do them better than we do.
And
Kate, did you want to answer that question too? Do you have
well,
a system?
I was smiling when you were talking about budgets, because that, I would say that's not for all of our studies and all of our sites, but certainly that can be a challenge for us, is paying sites, because we want to pay you, and we have, you know, we've got budgets in different years based on sort of the study of where we think the money is going to land. But for some sites, they might reconcile, you know, the scans for the study, but they might just do it at the end of the study. And then this whopping invoice, you know, comes in at the end, whereas, you know, we would be very happy to pay you earlier along the way for the work done. So I know, you know, it comes down to resource and challenges at site. But yeah, I think, you know, again, that communication with your partner. So that is the process, and that is the way your site does things, at least to be able to have that conversation. So you know, your industry partner is not going to get a shock when this massive invoice comes in it right at the end.
And I think it's interesting for us as clinical trial networks as well, is that industry are used to creating milestones based on participant recruitment. And for us, well, I know for us at ANZA, that's not always the best way for us to receive that support, because that's reliant on the sites and doesn't take into consideration the clinical trial network or the clinical trial group's activity that has to happen to make that study happen. So I know we've been successful in negotiating not only milestones that are per participant enrolment based, but also having some annual milestone payments.
I think all those are negotiable when you're going through that process, and it might look different for different studies, because some studies might have you know, might need to be front loaded with a little bit more funding in terms of setting it up, or for example, it might be a registry, or, you know, something like that where there's a greater investment required up front. So I think all those things are you know, negotiable, but I think it's really important to align and get those things right up front if we can, to avoid then having to make amendments and changes, you know, down the track.
Now, I do have one last question. Hopefully it's not too big. So from both of you, is industry supported or roadblocked by government regulation in Australia? Are the partnerships supported? Are there things in place at a government level that support our partnerships, or do you find that there's some roadblocks?
I think there's definitely some roadblocks, and I think it could be improved, particularly if it's government grant funded studies. I think there should be government incentives of some sort, I don't know what they might be, to enable industry to better support clinical trials that are grant funded, because that's a win-win for everyone. So the company should get some kind of help to do that, in my view.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are yeah, definitely. I think there are definitely some roadblocks, and I think about you know, rare cancers and things like that, where there's it's really challenging in Australia to, you know, have sufficient data to meet the government's requirements for approval of medicines in rare cancers and smaller populations, and, you know,
Oh, I think has frozen.
Sorry.
You froze for a moment there.
Sorry. I think, yeah, I don't know where I got up to or where it cut out, but I think in terms of that health equity for rare cancer patients, I think there's definitely more that can be done, and there are roadblocks just in terms of the way, you know, the PBS, I think, is set up, and you know, how we can do better for those patients.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I am going to wrap it up. There's a few things I want to say first. So if you've got any more questions, this is part of a series of masterclasses. There have been previous ones. So I was one of the speakers at the last masterclass and talked about funding avenues, along with Nisha Berthon-Jones from AGITG for clinical trial networks. So there are other options for you to listen in, or there are options for you to listen into those that have already taken place if you visit the ACTA website. There is also, if you can please complete the post-webinar survey. It does give you an opportunity to say what other topics you'd be interested in hearing about. So that would be great if you could do that. I'm sure it'll pop up somehow after this is all completed. And the other thing is, and Vivian didn't tell me to say this, but you may all be aware that there is the ACTA Symposium happening next week, from Monday through Wednesday next week. So many of us from the clinical trial networks will be represented there. I'll be there. So if you had any more questions that pop up in the meantime, you can find me somewhere there. But yeah, that ACTA Symposium each year is amazing. So I'm really looking forward to it, and the team member that's coming with me is as well. I know lots of people are. Vivian, you're back on here. I think everybody can see you now. Is there anything else you wanted to say on behalf of ACTA before we close up?
Thank you so much for mentioning our symposium, and thank you all for your time, you know, speakers, and your valuable knowledge, Jen for chairing, and of course everybody listening in and posing their questions. You're always welcome to reach out to ACTA if you have anything else, any other questions. Otherwise, we will leave it at that and hope to see you at the next event.